I know a lot of you are here tonight to hear about Seth's accident on February 13th and the incredible miracle that followed. But first I need to give you some background history leading up to February 13th, because my miraculous journey of a mother's faith, hope, and love actually began many years ago. At the age of 21, I was married to my husband, Chris. 10 months after our wedding, our first son, Michael, was born. Michael is now 28. 2 years later, the day before Michael's second birthday, our second son, Trinidad Joseph, was born. Only Trini was stillborn. He was full term, and the autopsy showed that every organ was perfectly developed. Doctors have no idea why Trini died in the womb. I can't go into all of the grief journey with Trini, but what I need to tell you is that it was primarily my faith and my family that got me through that grief journey. The next year we were expecting again, and we found out by ultrasound that we were having a little girl, and we named her Nicole Bernadette. When Nicole was born, she was breech, and I had had C-sections with both Trini and Michael, so Nicole was a VBAC with a breech after 2 C-sections. And the moment that she was born was the most incredible joy I've ever felt in one single moment. And I remember laying there just like almost yelling out, "Thank you, Jesus! Thank you, Jesus!" Because after losing Trini, this was amazing. But that joy quickly turned as doctors realized that Nicole was struggling to breathe. She was trying to cry, but only little squeaks were coming out. They weren't too alarmed because breech babies often have trouble breathing at first, and so they allowed my husband Chris to carry her to the nursery, and they were going to give her some oxygen support. They took this Polaroid picture for me so that I would have something to hold on to, that Chris and I would have something of our daughter while we waited for her. When it was time for the nurses to bring us to my actual room from the delivery room, they said, "Well, we will stop by the nursery and you can see Nicole and just set your mind at ease." The problem was we didn't stop at the nursery. We stopped instead at the neonatal intensive care unit, and before we could even see our daughter, the doctors approached us and they said, "I'm sure you know by now that your daughter is in critical condition." No, we didn't know that. They looked at us and they said, "She has one of 3 things. If it's the one we think, she will steadily go downhill until she dies." Nicole died 30 hours later. In those 30 hours, we spent them at her bedside, praying with her, talking to her, singing to her, and loving her while we could. In 30 hours, I went from the height of joy to the depths of despair. My grief with Nicole was similar to Trini's in the fact that it was God that got me through, and my faith and the sacraments that brought me comfort. But unlike Trini, her autopsy showed that she had a genetic kidney disease, and so with every pregnancy, our babies would have a 25% chance of developing the same fatal kidney disease. So from this point on, every pregnancy became an emotional roller coaster of hopes and dreams mixed with incredible fear. But we went on the next year to have our daughter Andrea, who's here tonight, who's now 23 years old. And we went on a year and a half later to have our son Seth, who now is 22 by the grace of God and a lot of your prayers. When Seth was 2 years old, we found out we were expecting again, found out by ultrasound that we had another little boy, and we named him John David. At 28 weeks in the womb, we were told that John David had the same fatal kidney disease that Nicole had. The doctors told us there was no hope. that there was nothing they could do, and John David would die shortly after birth. I still had 2 months to carry him in my womb, and during those 2 months, we prayed, we begged, and we pleaded with God to heal our son. I read through all the Gospels. I underlined all the miracles. They're packed. The Gospels are packed with miracles. I knew that Jesus could heal my little boy. And so every day, several times a day, I just begged him to. And we had contacted the Sisters of Charity. They were all praying. We were all seeking the intercession of Mother Teresa. This was going to be an incredible miracle to attribute toward her sainthood. I had big plans. I knew God could heal him, and I was convinced that he was going to. I even told people he was going to. On December 26th, John David was born with the kidney disease. Father Jim waited outside the delivery room and came in and baptized him as soon as he was allowed. At 12 hours after John David's birth, the doctors came to us and said the machines are no longer sustaining John David's life. So they unhooked him from the machines, and we held our son for the first and the last time. Father Jim came back to the hospital. He prayed over Chris and I. He prayed over John David, the prayers of the dying. And the whole time he prayed, I still kept begging the Lord for a miracle. I knew God didn't need the machines to heal John David. He could do it anyways. And I begged and I pleaded until 13 hours after John David's birth, when his heart beat for the very last time in the arms of his brother Michael, who was 8, and his sister Andrea, who was almost 4. My grief this time was extremely different. I was crushed. And I felt no comfort from God, no comfort from my faith, no comfort from the funeral, the music, nothing. And for 3 months, I literally felt like I was dying inside. It got to the point where I was just an empty shell. I had nothing to give, and I had 3 little kids to care for and a husband, and I worried about what kind of wife and mother I would become, because I was so empty. I felt dead. I could call the kids over. I could say all the right things. I love you, sweetheart. But I felt nothing. I felt dead, like I had buried everything good about myself with my son. And I didn't know how to change this. I was worried that I would never, ever come out of this. I was so afraid of what and who I was becoming, but I was powerless to change it. And so one of my friends said, Chris, why don't you just write a letter to God like your friend? Not as God, but just as your friend. And I like to journal, so I thought, okay, I'll try it. And I started this letter, and as I wrote, the things that poured out of me were not nice. And I realized in that moment that I was angry with God, really angry with God, because he crushed me. I said, Lord, how many times, how much can I bear? How many times will you continue to just stomp on my heart? And why did you lead me to believe in a miracle, knowing full well you weren't going to do it? Knowing full well how hurt I was going to be. And I couldn't understand what he was doing to me. So in writing this letter, I finally realized I was angry. Up to that point, I didn't know. I didn't realize. I think because I was always taught that God knows best, so how can we question God? But the truth was, I was angry. And I had to deal with that. So I couldn't finish the letter. I couldn't sign off on it. I couldn't let it go because I knew I needed to make up with God. I knew that my comfort would come from Him, but He was the one that punched me in the gut. So I couldn't go to Him for comfort. So I just sat on it. And after about 3 days of carrying around this intense anger, I just couldn't do it anymore. I knelt down in the chapel right upstairs. And I said, Lord, I give this anger to you. I can't do it anymore. I can't do this on my own. I need you and I want you. And in that moment, God's love rushed into my heart. It didn't take away the pain from losing John David, but it gave me the grace to walk through the grief. So after this, I decided that I needed to go to Father Jim to confess this anger toward God. And he looked at me and he said, Chris, you have not offended God. God understands your pain. However, when you hold on to anger, His love can't get through. You cannot receive His love. And he went on to describe exactly how I had been feeling and what had been happening to me over the past 3 months. So from that time, I did heal. I did find joy again, but I always felt wounded, broken. And I just thought that's the way life is. You have a lot of pain. You're a broken, wounded individual. A year later, we had our son, Ethan. And Ethan is now a freshman in college. And Ethan brought us tremendous joy and filled the emptiness that I had within me after losing John David. At this point, my husband Chris and I were content with our family. We were happy. We had 4 living children. We were good. I was afraid to risk that. What if I lost another one? What if I didn't come through it? Like what happened with John David, but I never came through it. I was afraid. So I was content right where I was at. But of course, there came a point when we were challenged to move past our fear. And I remember very well, it was Holy Week. And every homily that Holy Week was about not being afraid to open your hearts to love again. So we did. And we conceived another son. And we named him Jacob Francis. Throughout my pregnancy with Jacob, I read a book called Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence, and that book changed my life. Because the book wasn't just about accepting God's will, it was about desiring God's will. It was about being so completely conformed to God's will, trusting Him, surrendering to Him so completely that we know that God's will is best, and God's will is where we'll be happy, so we just desire that. We let go of our own desires and we desire God's will. So throughout that pregnancy, I prayed that God would change my heart, that God would open my heart and conform me and change me so that I would desire His will alone. And throughout this pregnancy, we did find out that Jacob too had the fatal kidney disease. And we begged and we pleaded with God to save our son. And we met with doctors, and we researched, and we did whatever we could to try to help him live. But the difference was, at the end of every prayer, I had to pray like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. Your will, Lord, not mine, be done. And I realized then that with John David, I had never prayed that way. Not even once. I had my will and my plan, and I wanted God to conform to me. So, on December 18th, Jacob was born. and he was born with the kidney disease. And Father Jim came to the hospital and baptized him immediately. And for 3 days we sat at Jacob's bedside, crying, praying, talking to him, singing to him, and loving him while we could. And I remember the night before Jacob died, I remember being at his bedside kind of like that. You'd just lean over his little bed, and the one part of his body I could hold real easily was his little baby foot, his soft baby foot and toes, and I would just rub that, and I would just talk to him. And I remember that night just bawling and trying to talk to him through my tears and telling him how much I loved him and how much I wanted him to stay. How much I wanted to be his mommy and care for him like only a mother does. And I begged and I pleaded with God, please, God, please let Jacob stay. I don't care how difficult it is, we'll do anything. Please don't take our son again. But even in that moment, right there with my little baby boy, crying, praying, talking to him, loving him, I had to end that prayer with, your will, Lord, not mine, be done. And Jacob died the next morning. This time my grief, I did have comfort from God, comfort through the funeral, the music, my faith. But then after the funeral and everything was done, I just sort of felt left alone to somehow try to pick up the pieces of my life. And one night, I sat on my couch and I cried out to God and I said, Lord, you asked me to open my heart to love again, and I did. You asked me to give Jacob back to you, and I did. And now, here I am, just left all alone to try to figure out how to get up every morning and how to keep going. And in that moment when I cried out to God, his peace came. And it was like he said to me, oh no, Chris, I have a plan for you right now, right in the middle of your grief. And he did. And this is very hard to explain, but over the next 2 weeks, he showed me something incredible. I can only describe it as a glimpse of heaven. It was like, for a short time, I could see through his eyes how he sees, not my own. And in that time period, his plan was perfect. And it was beautiful. And I can't even tell you why. But all I know is it was more real than anything else in my life. It was just as real as everything else. And in that time, I felt so privileged to be Jacob's mother, to be a part of God's plan for all of these children. And I even wrote in my journal that holding Jacob alive in my arms would not bring me more joy. Humanly, that makes no sense at all. It was a supernatural experience. And in that time, God showed me without a doubt that his plan is perfect even when it hurts and even when I can't understand it. And in that time, God gave me a peace and a deep joy right in the middle of my pain. It's hard to understand. But throughout that time, God healed me completely of Jacob's loss, John David's, Trini's, and Nicole's. And I am no longer a wounded, broken person because of them. So we went on from there, and we were blessed with 3 healthy children in a row. Caleb, who's now 15, Mary Kate, who's here, who's now 13, and Peter, who is 10. And I became a busy mom of 7 children. And during this time, all these past 17 years, I have wanted to write a book about my journeys with the babies and what God showed me and what He taught me. But I was a busy mom of 7 kids. So about 1.5 to 2 years ago, I was listening to a homily online, and the title of the homily was "Do It Now." And the whole gist of the talk was, if there's something that you've been putting off that you know you're supposed to do it now. And so I did. And I wrote the book. It's not edited yet, but it's written. And why is this important leading up to February 13th? Because for that whole year before the tragedy of February 13th, God was preparing me. Because as much as He taught me 17 years ago, I'm very human. My memory is short, and I worry way too much, and I trust way too little. So in this year of writing this book, God brought all those lessons right up to the forefront of my mind and my heart. Another piece I need to tell you is the night before Seth's accident. Chris and I had a conversation with Seth, and Seth was talking about all his hopes and his dreams and where his life was headed. And he is a guy with lofty dreams, the type of dreams that many people never attain. And in that talk, the whole gist of the talk was my husband and I telling Seth that, Seth, no matter what you accomplish in life, how successful you are, or how many hopes and dreams and goals you achieve, you will never truly be happy unless you are in God's will. If you seek Him first, you will have peace, and all else will come into play as it's meant to be, and that is where you will be fulfilled. That was the gist of our conversation. So the very next night, February 13th, our 21-year-old son Seth falls 25 feet through a roof onto concrete, sustaining a serious brain injury. Is in the ICU on a ventilator in an induced coma, fighting for his life. And there my husband and I are back in the ICU once again. And we held each other. And we just thought, Lord, how many? How many is it going to take? It was very surreal and very difficult. Never did we think we'd be back in the ICU with our 21-year-old child. I have to tell you, I'm so grateful for my husband, for a man of faith to walk by my side through everything we have had to walk through. He has been a gift, and I don't know how I would ever do it without him. But there we were. And the doctors told us that Seth indeed could die, that the next 24 hours would be critical. But honestly, the 24 hours stretched to several days. And during that time, Seth could have no stimulation at all, which meant that we sat in darkness and silence and freezing cold because he had a dangerously high temperature. So for days, while my husband and I and our older children were all together, we were very much alone in darkness, silence, and freezing cold. We were alone in our prayers and alone in our thoughts. And I don't think I have to tell any of you the kind of thoughts that you have when your son is laying in the balance between life and death. The memories that flood your mind. The fear that maybe you'll never talk to him again, never see him smile or hear him laugh. The little things that you took for granted that you just hope and pray that you'll get to see again. But also what kept going through my mind were the words that we had spoken to Seth the night before. You will never be happy unless you are in God's will. And I thought, This isn't what I meant, God. This is not what I was talking about. And also the words of the book. For a year, I had been writing about surrendering and trusting God so completely. And knowing that His will is best even when we can't understand it. And I thought to myself, I said all those words. I meant all those words. And now somehow I have to live them. Day after day we sat there. And it just seemed like there was one complication after another. And every complication meant that we were delaying waking Seth up and finding out if we would ever get our son back. So by day 6, there was another complication. Now we had pneumonia. And at this point, my husband and I both just lost it. We had had it. And my husband walked out of the room, went outside, and just began to pray his rosary. And I walked out of the room, and I went down to the hospital chapel, and I was all alone in that chapel. I knelt down on the floor, and I bent over and sobbed. And I sobbed, and I sobbed, and I said, "No, God, please, no, not this." And I knew what I needed to do in that chapel. I knew that I needed to surrender Seth to God, but I didn't want to. I was afraid to, because I know darn well that God's will and mine often are not the same, and I did not want to let Seth go. I couldn't lose him now. So I wrestled with myself, and I wrestled with God in that chapel. And finally, with every ounce of strength within me, before I left that chapel, with my teeth clenched and my fist clenched and tears streaming down my face, I said, "Okay, God, your will, not mine, be done for Seth." And I have to tell you, there was no warm, fuzzy feeling, no peace that rushed into my heart, no sentiment at all. It was a pure, conscious act of my will. And it wasn't one and done, because the days to follow were some of the darkest. I had to continually, from that moment on, surrender Seth to Christ. And I prayed the surrender novena that's on your tables, sometimes several times a day. And I invite you to take a copy home and pray it. It's a beautiful prayer. Like I said, some of the next days were the darkest because we got the MRI report, and it was the worst report we could have gotten. Seth had the worst type of brain injury he could have had. He had a shearing or shredding of the brain. He had brain bleeds all throughout the brain, as well as the brain stem. At this point, doctors didn't even know if Seth would wake up. And if he did, they didn't think he'd be able to handle a place like Mary Free Bed. They started talking to us about long-term, lower functioning rehab centers. We waited then for days. As they finally were able to cut the sedation, we waited for days for Seth, for any sign of Seth. And I have to tell you, his waking up, it was very gradual. It wasn't like, oh, we cut the meds off, now Seth's awake. No, it was very, very gradual. In fact, this was often our idea of awake. Just slits in his eyes. And sometimes you could look into those eyes and you could connect with Seth. And other times I would look into those eyes and there was nothing. It was like he was gone. It was terrifying. He was in and out of sleep, in and out of awareness. But we had a doctor from Mary Free Bed who, by the grace of God, took Seth to Mary Free Bed and was willing to give him a chance. And I think most of you know the story, how it went from there. Because when Seth got to Mary Free Bed, they had to use a mechanical lift to move him from the bed to the chair, to the wheelchair. He couldn't even hold his own neck. He couldn't support his own neck to hold his head up. He couldn't support his back and hold his back up. Couldn't even sit. Couldn't control most of the left side of his body. Couldn't eat, couldn't swallow, couldn't talk. He was in bad shape, and they thought they'd have him at least 10 weeks. But as it went, Seth left in 4 weeks. And before he did, the day before he left, he was jogging down the hallway. There was not a single doctor, nurse, or therapist that would deny that Seth's recovery was miraculous. I don't know if I've ever heard so many medical professionals use the word miracle. From the therapist to the nurses, Seth is an anomaly. Seth changes every 24 hours. That doesn't usually happen. I don't even know how to plan for Seth because every day he's different already. The doctor, I can't tell you the number of times he walked into Seth's room, looked at him and said, "You are incredible. Your MRI says you should be dead or severely brain damaged." God heard your prayers. He heard our prayers, and he answered our request. But as amazing as that was, and is, there was something even more amazing, and that was a spiritual miracle. Before Seth could even talk, he wrote this. This was one of his very first communications to us. We thought maybe he'd be angry when he woke up. I mean, he was out having a great time with his buddies, and now he's helpless in a hospital bed. And he's telling us, my God is good. He had no anger. He was so peaceful and very grateful. And we realized later, when he could talk, that he didn't wake up from being out with his buddies. He had woken up from the presence of God. When he was in the coma, he had an out-of-body experience. He saw himself in the ICU, and he knew he was fighting for his life. In fact, he told us it would have been easy to die. But he begged and he pleaded with God for his life, and God granted his request. So when Seth woke up, he was filled with gratitude. Even the therapists would comment, usually 21-year-olds are so self-absorbed. Not Seth. He was grateful for every moment he had and every bit of help that people gave him. The miracle was Jesus right in the middle of the pain. Seth wasn't peaceful because he was okay, because he was healed, because at this point he wasn't. He was helpless in a hospital. But he had peace because he had encountered Christ. Jesus is the miracle right in the middle of the suffering. When Seth could talk, then he started telling us things that were just so inspiring. And I just sat there like, he said like this, the gifts God gives are greater than anything we could ever imagine. He told us that this world looks so attractive, but it's really not. Not when you've seen the other side. And this one, he said, I'd rather be laying in this hospital bed with nothing but in God's will than have everything back and not be in God's will. At this point in the journey, Seth had little to no physical talents or abilities, but spiritually, it was like we were seeing the beauty of a purified soul. It was like we were seeing the potential in each one of us when we get rid of the messiness of our lives. It was honestly the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. I was in awe and my mind was just blown so much of the time. It was like God was giving me a glimpse of heaven again, this time through Seth. But you know, God's given me so much. He's blessed me so much. But still, I am so human and I worry far too much and trust far too little. And I emotionally at this point was so confused. Because on the one hand, my mind was blown, and on the other hand, my heart was broken. Because I didn't know at this point what my son's life was going to look like. I was watching him in a wheelchair, unable to walk. I was watching my 23-year-old daughter, Andrea, feeding him. I didn't know what Seth's life on earth was going to look like. And it broke my heart to watch my son suffer. And on the other hand, my spirit was just on fire, burning within me because I saw this peace in my son that I had never seen before. So I'm sitting at home one night. I went home to sleep that night. And I'm just sitting there trying to process all of these emotions. And Caleb, who was 14 at the time, he comes to me and he says, Mom, knowing what you know, the spiritual experience that Seth had, if you could go back and make the accident never happen, would you? I didn't know how to answer that question. I mean, first of all, I couldn't handle that kind of question right then. But seriously, how do you answer that? I wish I could stand up here and say, I am so completely conformed to God's will that if that is God's will for Seth, then no, don't change a thing. But I'm not there. I'm weak and I'm human. And I was still scared. But you know, I put the question to you in this way because I think it's a hard one to answer in words. I don't think we answer it in words. I think we answer it by how we choose to live our life every single day. Do we pursue and put at priority in our lives our gifts and our talents and our abilities? Or do we pursue the heart of Jesus? Which one is first in our lives every single day? I think that's how we need to answer the question. After Seth told us his spiritual experience, he began forgetting really quickly, which was very disconcerting to him. He did not want to forget, and he was afraid he was going to forget, and he was. So he said, can you call Father Jim? So Father Jim came to Mary Free Bed, and Seth, explained to him everything that had happened. And Father Jim said, Seth, you have described what the saints have seen and reported. Mind blown once again. He told him, he said, Seth, God allowed you to see through your spiritual eyes and to feel through your spiritual senses. But when he decided to send you back here, now you have to see through your bodily eyes and feel through your bodily senses. You cannot live in both. Therefore, you will forget. He said it was a gift. You were given a gift, and now you need to surrender it back to Christ and trust that He'll give it to you when you need it. You have to live by faith once again. But one experience showed me very clearly where our meeting place with Christ is, where He will always be present to us. We were at Mary Free Bed. Seth was just beginning to be allowed to eat. And the hospital minister came and said, can he receive the Eucharist? So he was finally able to receive the Eucharist, but we had the speech therapist waiting to work with him and the nutritionist standing there waiting to talk to him. So they were very nice and they said, well, go ahead, he can have the Eucharist. And so they gave Seth the Eucharist and they gave me the Eucharist. And I said my hurried little prayer because everyone's waiting and we gotta get moving. And I opened my eyes and I look at Seth and he was in complete ecstasy. And he told me later, he said, Mom, the minute I received the Eucharist, in that instant, Jesus was right here with me, just like when I was in the coma. And he said it made me realize then that that's how it always is when we receive the Eucharist, even when we can't see it. Jesus is the miracle. The Eucharist is our meeting place with Christ. And this miracle is here for us too. Do we recognize the miracle and the gift every time we approach to receive him? I know I don't, and I certainly didn't that day. The longer it's been since the accident, the more Seth has forgotten. But he wakes up every morning and knows that he is changed. He has a renewed outlook on life, a renewed faith. Did it make him a perfect person? Oh no. He struggles and he sins and he has temptations just like the rest of us. He has to live by faith now, just like the rest of us. But it did give him an undying resolve to strive. As time passes even more, even parts of the physical recovery, a lot of the time at Mary Free Bed is becoming a blur to him in his memories. But like the spiritual, he wakes up every single day very aware that he is different. Many of the talents and gifts and abilities, the things that he put his identity in, the things that he was proud of, many of those are gone. And he said to me, Mom, the things that I liked most about myself are gone. Seth is being asked to surrender everything to Christ. He is being asked to put his identity, his self-worth, and his trust completely in Jesus. We all prayed so hard for Seth. And God heard our prayers and he granted our request. But I'm wondering, was it all just so that one young man could walk and talk again? Or even take it a step further? Was it all so that one young man could have a renewed faith and really learn how to surrender himself to Christ? I don't think so. This miracle is for all of us. Because guess what? God isn't just asking Seth to trust him or Seth to put his identity in God. God is asking each of us, you and me, to put our whole identity in him, to come to him with our hopes and our dreams as well as our sorrows, our pain and our fears. He wants us to surrender everything to him and seek him first. He's calling each one of us this Advent and always to himself. He invites us to rest in his heart right where we're at. We don't have to be any certain way. He loves us as we are, and he's calling us to himself with all the messiness of our lives. When I finish up here in just about 1 minute, We're going to put on a video that I made with pictures and music, just kind of wrapping up this journey. But before I do, I want to leave you with one last message that God gave to Seth while he was in the coma. And I believe it is a challenge to us and also an invitation to us. God said to Seth, "Look how they all pray because you are injured. But I am here always." He's calling you. He's waiting for you. Let's seek him. Thank you.